this stage, any kind of comments or feedback you have is very, very welcome. So please feel free to jump in whenever you have questions. So this is joint work with Robert Dur from Rotterdam and with Stefan Meyer from Columbia University. And in this paper, we're trying to understand how these attitudes against immigration are being shaped over time. And we're building this on a kind of small but growing literature, which shows that growing up in a recession, the kind of experiences that you have as growing up, especially the macroeconomic ones, do tend to have quite long-lasting impacts on people's preferences and beliefs and attitudes. So we want to see where anti-immigration attitudes kind of fit in this bigger picture. So just to give you kind of a little bit of motivation and background, why are we interested in this question? So recessions and business cycles are very much a fact of life. And currently, it looks very likely that we are already in a worldwide recession, or that we are very soon going to head into quite a severe recession. And for example, at the end of 2020, unemployment in the US was around 7%. The figure was much, much higher earlier in the year, which is very high given the unemployment figures we're used to seeing from the US. The figure was somewhat lower in the UK, but still pretty high, and widely expected to increase as the furlough scheme is going to wind down in the coming months. And what is particularly interesting here is that a very large number of people all around the world are currently sharing into this experience at the same time. And so based on that, one general question that comes to mind is, does it really matter when people experience these shocks, right? So we have, for example, in the UK, there's grave concern that is particularly the young people who have been affected by this crisis, right? So the figures tell us that those below 25 years of age are most likely to have lost their job. And there's, of course, growing concern that young people who are in education now are going to suffer quite a lot in the long run. So, of course, it is really important to understand whether these experiences that they have right now are going to create a permanent shift in their preferences or beliefs later in life. And kind of to narrow down this very broad question a little bit, how will these shared experiences affect their other regarding preferences, especially pro-social behavior and immigration attitudes? And so, as I said, there is growing evidence that the macroeconomic conditions that people experience during their impressionable years tend to have very persistent impact on people's attitudes and preferences. And so if you're not familiar with this literature, the impressionable years usually refer to ages between 18 and 25, which seems maybe a little bit arbitrary if you're not familiar with the literature, but there have been quite a lot of studies which show these years consistently coming up as very important, mostly because people make very important educational decisions or because they enter the labor market at that time. And it does seem that whatever shifts to preferences and attitudes happen in this period tend to be very persistent, right? So once we have this shift, there is very little decay over the lifetime. And so if you look at the previous literature on this topic, there are kind of two a little bit contrasting strands in literature. So on the one hand, you have what I would call the optimistic view. And here the seminal studies, Giuliano and Spilimbergo in the Review of Economic Studies, which show that in the US, people who grow up in a recession tend to have stronger preferences for redistribution. They're more likely to vote for the Democratic Party in the US, which makes sense because they have much more policies targeted to redistribution. And they also tend to think that success in life is far more likely, or actually failure in life is far more likely to be driven by luck than by hard work, right? On the other hand, people who grow up in particularly good times where jobs are abundant and the economy is doing well tend to be less in favor of redistribution, more likely to vote Republican, and more likely to think that success is driven by hard work. And so the kind of argument that Giuliano and Spilimbergo are building in this paper is that this comes from a shift in compassion, right? The idea being that if you entered the labor market or you grew up in times that were particularly bad, and jobs were scarce and you saw a lot of suffering around you, then for the rest of your life, you're going to be far more compassionate to people who are going through similar experiences. And again, in the more psychology literature, Emily Bianchi has a couple of papers where she uses similar methods to show that if you grow up in a recession, you're more likely to be less narcissistic and less individualistic, care more about society and about community. On the other hand, you have what I would call the more pessimistic view. So this is also a related paper, which is joint work with similar co-authors. in which we show that in the US, if you grow up during these difficult times, young people tend to prioritize income as far more important as a work attribute for the rest of their lives, and they are far less likely to be interested in doing meaningful work or doing work which is useful for society. And there is some evidence that in times of recessions, attitudes against outgroups increase, right? So a negative feeling towards immigrants or towards people who don't share your attributes tend to be fueled when there is competition for scarce resources. So I guess the question we're trying to answer here is, okay, how do we reconcile this optimistic and pessimistic view? Well, one way to ask this question is, if there is an increase in compassion because of growing in this difficult time, is this really universal, or is it something that it's a bit more parochial in its nature? And secondly, how does experiencing these different macroeconomic conditions during one's impressionable years affect their views towards immigration? So from a theoretical perspective, there are a number of theories or ideas on how current macroeconomic conditions are going to affect immigration attitudes. So again, there's not much evidence on how your previous experiences are going to impact this, but how your current ones will. And this is kind of linked to labor market competition theories, where the idea is that in bad times, there are fewer jobs, so the competition for jobs is higher, and there is stronger competition for government transfers. So this is going to fuel negative attitudes against immigration. And so there's a number of papers here. I think Maida 2006 is the more seminal one, where she looks at a cross-section of countries and finds that indeed recessions do intensify competition, and this effect seems to be, well, at least, or correlation, seems to be particularly strong for unskilled worker in rich countries, right? And this is not a kind of foreign argument. If you watch the news in the US in the last few years, you see that there is quite a lot of discussion, a lot of especially unskilled workers in the US, people who live in relative poverty, tend to have quite strong beliefs that unskilled immigrants are going to directly compete with them for jobs, and they tend to have more anti-immigration attitudes.
Maria,
again, yes, please.
There's one literature in psychology which looks at uncertainty and how uncertainty leads to more conservative clinging to your own worldviews, and also stereotyping against people, and also clinging more to your in-group versus your out-group.
It's very interesting. So if you can, if you could send me the study, that would be very interesting. So we can't really say much about uncertainty here, but it sounds like a very plausible mechanism, for sure. And again, so there's quite a lot of mixed results in this literature. It's mostly correlational studies, and there's a lot of large individual heterogeneity, right? So in a sense, the results matter a lot, whether you look at rich countries or poor countries, or whether you look at skilled or unskilled workers. So we're going to try to address that as well. So I would say that overall, this paper tries to make a contribution across 3 different strands of literature. So on the one hand, you have the attitudes towards immigration literature, and here we show that these attitudes do tend to be shaped by experiences when young, especially macroeconomic experiences. And so this indicates that there could be long-term consequences to recessions which are not particularly understood or taken into account right now. And we do find some support for the labor market competition theory, which might explain the large heterogeneity that we've seen in different studies. With respect to redistribution and immigration, we find that the results of Giuliano and Spilimbergo, the study I mentioned earlier in the US, are unlikely to be explained by a universal increase in compassion, right? So the finding that people who grow up in recessions tend to be more in favor of redistribution might not be seen as the kind of altruistic, compassionate behavior that they're trying to portray. It might actually be a little bit more selfish or a bit more contingent to who you are compassionate towards. And there is some indication that, attitudes towards immigration and redistribution may well go hand in hand here, which I guess is not so surprising. And finally, we're also going to try to say something about parochialism and about the forming of in versus out group preferences. And we show that part of these preferences are explained by your experiences growing up. So empirically, the paper is divided in two parts. So first of all, we're going to try to really dive into the US. This is a particularly interesting country to study because it's a rich, developed country which has a relatively large inflow of immigrants every year, and a non-trivial share of these immigrants tend to be low-skilled or come from underdeveloped countries. And so we're going to look at the US using the General Social Survey. And then in the second part of the paper, we would like to ask, okay, how universal is this? Is this specific to the US? Is it specific to a small group of wealthy nations, like, for example, European countries? Or is this something that we find consistently across the world? And so to answer this, we're going to use the World Value Study, World Value Survey, sorry, which looks about 100 different countries. And empirically, we're going to first of all look at the main effect of income experiences during your impressionable years on anti-immigration attitudes. And then we're also going to do a subgroup analysis to kind of have a better understanding of the mechanism or the heterogeneity here. And so we're going to look both at low and high skilled workers kind of proxied by their education or by their parents' education. And finally, we're going to use the World Value Survey to also say something about parochialism and to see whether macroeconomic experiences are simply related to anti-immigration attitudes, or is it about people who simply share different attributes than you, right? So they're from a different group. And so let me just go into the US results first. So we're going to use the General Social Survey. So this has been running in the US since the 1970s, and I think by now there have been a bit over 30 waves. And the question that we're really interested in has been asked since 1994 in 10 different waves. And it asked Americans, do you think that the number of immigrants to America nowadays should be increased a lot to reduced a lot on a 5-point scale? So this is what we're going to label anti-immigration attitudes, and so a higher answer is going to correspond to a more anti-immigration attitude. So let me just give you a quick feel of how the data looks. So this is plotting the share of Americans who answer each category to the question since 1995. So I think there's kind of two striking things here. First of all, a very small number of Americans actually have a positive attitude towards immigration, right? So very, very few people believe that immigration should increase a lot or increase a little, and the vast majority are either neutral or have a pretty negative attitude. They think that immigration should decrease. However, since the early 1990s, there has been a shift in these attitudes, and what I would argue it's a more positive direction. So more people right now tend to be more neutral or positive towards immigration than they were 20 years ago. But overall, a lot of people in America do have quite strong anti-immigration attitudes. So if you're familiar with the General Social Survey, you will know that it's a repeated cross-section. So unfortunately, we do not have panel data here. And so the main empirical challenge when trying to explain the effect of experiences on attitudes is going to be that cohorts tend to share many experiences, right? So it's not just immigration experiences or income experiences, but also technology shocks and many other things, right? So you can come with loads of examples here. And so in our identification, we're going to use regional variation in macroeconomic conditions that people experience during their impressionable years, right? So in the past, and this should allow us to control for time variant common shocks, right? Like technology or other national and global shocks. And so in our identification strategy, we are also going to control for year fixed effects, region fixed effects, age and birth fixed effects. And many of you will be familiar with this fallacy that there is a perfect collinearity between time, age, and birth cohort fixed effects. So in order to find a way to break this collinearity, we're actually going to follow Giuliano and Spilimbergo and also Rosen, and we're going to include a limited number of cohort dummies, right? Essentially one for each decade. Of course, this is kind of making a structural assumption on it. So in the papers, we're going to try to make many different ways to break this collinearity, right? Either we're going to break it to age dummies or year trends, linear trends, and it seems that it doesn't really impact our results one way or another. So let me just walk you through our main specification, and if you have any questions, please do stop me and I'm happy to explain it. So we're just going to have a simple OLS regression in which the dependent variable is going to be the anti-immigration attitudes, which I showed you the question a few slides ago. So the attitudes here are going to be the attitudes on a scale from 1 to 5 of respondent I, who at time T of the survey is going to live in region R in the US, right? And our main explanatory variable is going to be the income level that you experience between 18 and 25, right? That respondent I experienced in their impressionable years. And this is going to be given by the logarithm of real income per capita in your region during your impressionable years. Now, ideally, we would have data on the exact region in which each individual resided during their impressionable years. Now, unfortunately, we do not have that information, but we do know where people lived at the age of 16, right? So we kind of use that information that if you lived in a certain region at 16, we use that as a proxy that you lived there during your impressionable years. Later on, I will show you that if we restrict the results just to people who never moved or people who did move, we find that the results are very comparable. So we think that this is a pretty good proxy for that. Now, the income level comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the US. It's at the regional level and is going back to the 1920s, which is very nice because we essentially have about 100 years of data on this regional income level. So we can really capture especially the older people in our sample all the way back to, for example, the Great Depression or other crises in the 70s, right? And in order to calculate this, we're going to look at the income level every year during your impressionable years, and we're simply going to take a weighted average of that. Later on, if we have time, I can show you some robustness checks in which we try to construct this measure in all kinds of different ways, and then we can discuss how that changes the results.
Maria.
Yes.
Regarding the income level, should this not be some sort of like deviation from sort of like the natural rate of output or something, which has been there to like get into shocks?
Yeah, so there's many ways in which you can do this. So one way, which we also do in our robustness checks, and the results are quite similar, is to, for example, create a recession indicator. So this is something that Giuliano and Spirenberger do as well. The problem with that is that it's very difficult to do that without making any assumptions. So we think that the income level is the most agnostic way to look at this for two reasons. First of all, if you're just going to take the kind of natural definition of experiencing a recession, negative growth, then it turns out that something close to 90% of our sample experienced this at some point during their impressionable years. And so then the way to deal with this, which is also what Giuliano and Spirenberger do, is to kind of take an arbitrary threshold based on your data distribution where the negative growth is large enough that you would label this a recession, which we think is kind of making some a bit arbitrary assumptions about the data distribution. So this is why we choose to go with the income level. But if we take this approach, we find very similar results, just a little bit more noisy. But I can come back to that in a few slides.
I can follow up on this.
But doesn't the time dummy do that job of making everything relative?
So the income level here is the income level during your impressionable years. So this will not just vary over time, but will also vary across people's ages, right? Because different people would have different ages at different times and in different regions. So in a sense, just the time fixed effects alone will not capture that.
Yeah, okay. You could put, yeah, okay.
Okay.
Can I have a follow-up question on this?
Sure.
So literature on this formation of skills, the people often use this Hodrick-Prescott filter, and they isolate the cycle from the trend in the series. There's something what you could possibly do here with income level or employment as well. And so you kind of then control, like your main measure would be a cycle, and then at the same time you would be able to control for the trend in general trend in income level or employment. Yeah,
no, that's a good point. And we also have some results where we specifically look at unemployment So maybe I can show you that later and try to address that. But yeah, thanks. And yeah, so as you probably have guessed, there is no kind of exogenous variation here. So our identification strategy essentially relies on carefully trying to control for unobservables. So it's important to do that, of course. And luckily in the GSS, we have very rich data on people's background. So we know, of course, their education, parental education, we know their income growing up, and so on and so forth. And as I said, we also control for time and region fixed effects. And we make sure to cluster the standard errors at the region level. So let me just kind of show you the very main results, which I think is one of the big takeaways of the paper. So here the dependent variable is anti-immigration attitudes, where a higher value is a more negative attitude. And what you can see is that if the income level during your impressionable years doubles, then you're going to be 0.4 less anti-immigration on a 5-point scale. And this effect seems to be consistent even when we control for household income, education, and labor market status, which are kind of the usual suspects of endogenous variables, right? So this to us is easily interpreted as this effect is not just going through these channels, right? So it is on top of those particular possible channels. And so how to kind of interpret the magnitude of this coefficient? So a doubling of income level leads to 0.4 less anti-immigration attitudes. Well, by comparison, a doubling of household income is going to have an effect in the same direction, but this is 0.013, so substantially smaller. And it is equivalent to 75% of the effect of having both parents as immigrants to the US. So the people who are children of immigrants are far more likely to have pro-immigration attitudes. A doubling of income, it's equivalent to 75% of that. Now, of course, a doubling of income is also a pretty large effect. And so in the paper, we show that we do have quite a lot of regional variation in this, right? So a doubling of income is kind of the difference between California and I think the Rust Belt during the Great Depression. In other times, it is about 60 to 70% of that in crises, but there's still a lot of variation there. So we believe that this effect is reasonably significant in magnitude. So how persistent is this? Once people experience this during their impressionable years, is it going to go away in a few years, or is it really going to remain? And so to do that, we just simply interact our income level experiences with different age groups. And so if you look at column 3 in this table, the reference category here are young people who are during their impressionable years at the time of the survey. And you can see that if we interacted for those who are between 26 to 50, or those who are between 51 and 75, there is virtually no decay over time. Right, so this essentially tells you that if you've experienced this shock during your impressionable years, you're going to be 0.4 less or more anti-immigration, and this is not really going to change anymore, at least up to the age of 75. So there appears to be a lot of persistence in this, and this finding is not unique to this study. This is something that has been acknowledged in this literature. Now, coming back to some of the robustness checks that we do, and we already discussed this a little bit, but here are a couple of other things that we look at. So one of them is, so maybe I can just go to the table very quickly. So one thing that we also want to control for is the standard deviation of income during impressionable years, because if you just take an average of experiences, this is not going to capture that this average would be the same for somebody who experienced the same income every year, or somebody who experienced very high and very low income. And so when we take that volatility into account, it doesn't really seem to matter a lot. We also look at income at the time of the survey, which matters too, but it is more noisy. We construct this recession indicator in the same way that Juliana and Spilimberga do, and you see that growing up in a recession is going to increase anti-immigration attitudes, right? So this is a dummy, I suppose, of being on a 5-point scale. So the coefficient is smaller and noisier, but I would say that overall does not change the conclusions. And again, we also look at experienced unemployment. So the reason we don't focus on unemployment is because in the US, unemployment data at the regional level only goes back to the 1970s. So of course, then we can only capture the relatively younger people, but when we do that, we find similar results. Another thing that we look at is your experiences of immigration inflows, right? So the concern is that if you're growing up or during your impressionable years, there's a huge inflow of immigration to the United States that may well shape your beliefs as well about immigrants. And of course, this may well be correlated with income experiences, right? So in particularly good times, it's possible that more immigrants will be allowed in the country. And so to do that, we also control for different, so these are quantiles of immigration experiences, right? Where the reference category are people who experience the lowest quantile of immigration inflows during your impressionable years. And so what this shows essentially is that the more immigrants that came to the US during your impressionable years, the more anti-immigration you're going to be. But this effect is on top of the income effect, right? So it doesn't explain away the coefficient that we find on income. And finally, so I'm running a bit short on time, so I don't want to spend too much on it, but we also look very carefully at whether it could be other periods in your life rather than the impressionable years. And we find, kind of in line with the literature, that other periods matter a lot less or not at all. So it really is this 18 to 25. We also want to know the heterogeneity here, right? So who is most affected by this experience? I mentioned that some studies find that it should be mostly low-skilled workers in rich countries that have strong anti-immigration attitudes. And so we also do a test by education. So the first two columns look at people who are low-skilled and high-skilled, and the last two columns look by your father's education. This seems to be at least descriptively in line with these theories of labor market competition, where low-skilled people or parents whose father was low-skilled are far more responsive to these types of shocks, although these ones are not significantly different from each other. So here we are a little bit more confident. But again, this seems to indicate that if your parents were educated or a proxy for wealthy, or if you're wealthy, then you're going to care a lot less about these shocks, right? While the low-skilled are far more responsive. So just to summarize what we found in the US, experiencing high original income during your impressionable years is going to make people more in favor of immigration. We argue that this effect is reasonably large and also very persistent, so we don't see any evidence of decay. And we find some descriptive evidence that lower skilled workers are the ones who are more affected by these macroeconomic conditions, even controlling for their current income and labor market status. So we're kind of shutting down those channels, and we still find this heterogeneity. But of course, the question is the US a special case, or is this something that we observe more broadly? So we look at the World Value Survey, which is, again, a repeated cross-section, but they do have data on about 100 different countries, both developed and developing. And there we focus on two different questions. So the first one, which we call immigration restriction, asks, should the government restrict people from other countries coming here to work? And the second question, which we call native priorities, is should employers give priority to people from these nations over immigrants when jobs are scarce? So these questions in many ways are quite similar, but we believe that the second question makes the competition between natives and immigrants a little bit more salient, because it directly asks people whether they should be given priority over immigrants. But of course, we ex ante expect them to go very much in the same direction. Now, to calculate people's experienced income during impressionable years, we used the data set developed by Madison and Bolt, and they have calculated inflation-adjusted GDP per capita in about, I think, 150 countries. And for many of them, the data goes back to 100 years or so. Of course, for some countries, it is more reliable than for others, but this has been used in many studies and is considered a pretty reliable measure. So our estimation strategy is very, very similar to what we do in the GSS, also because we want it to be comparable. So again, the dependent variable is the attitude of respondent I living in country C at time t. The income level is constructed in the exact same way, but now the variation is across countries as opposed to regions. And we control for, again, a rich set of demographics. These luckily are quite similar between the GSS and the World Value Survey. And we also control for time and region fixed effects, and we cluster our standard errors at the level of the country. So very similar. So what do we find? Well, keep in mind that the immigration restriction is on a 4-point scale and native priority is a dummy variable. So this is why these coefficients are a bit larger. But overall, they kind of confirm the findings from the US and show that people who experience the doubling of income are going to be less anti-restricting immigrants to come to the US, and they're less likely to say that natives should be given priority over immigrants in times when jobs are scarce, which is kind of really getting to this labor market competition channel. And again, in line with what we find in the GSS, there is very little decay for both measures. So this is by looking at the interaction where the reference category is the young people in their impressionable years, so 0.71 and 0.25, and we want to see how much this changes as you age, and it seems to change very little actually. Here we also look at current income and the standard deviation of income, and we find very similar results. Unfortunately, we don't have a very good unemployment global database where we can have data back to the 60s or 70s, although of course that would be great. And again, we find that it is mostly the impressionable years that matter rather than different age groups. So just to summarize the main results, as in the GSS, we find that globally, experiencing bad macroeconomic conditions impacts immigration attitudes. So people are going to be more anti-immigration, and we find very little decay over time. Now, we also try to look at this by the skill level and by the development level of countries. So here, on the one hand, we're trying to understand, is it mostly a phenomena which we observe in wealthy countries because they tend to have this influx of low-skilled workers who compete with natives? And the second thing we're trying to understand, is it mostly high-skilled people or low-skilled people, regardless of the development level of the country? So with respect to the first question, now we kind of split the sample of countries between what we call rich countries. So this is mostly the OECD nations and the rest of the world, which is emerging or developing economies. And we also have a little bit less power, but the finding seems to be that the effect is much stronger in rich countries, right? So people who experienced recessions or grew up in bad times in rich countries are going to be much more responsive to this when it comes to forming anti-immigration attitudes, even though the effect is still there in poorer countries. It's just a bit smaller. These ones are statistically significant from each other as well, so the evidence is a bit stronger for the jobs priority question. This one, I think it's just insignificant. So here I'm also trying to show you what happens by education, but here keep in mind that we're losing a lot. Yes?
Could we ask you, I mean, there's much less immigration into non-OECD countries. So it'd be interesting to know what just the absolute levels of sentiment are in these different groups of countries.
Yes, no, so that's a very fair point. So even though actually on the first question, I would say that there is actually quite a lot of immigration in poorer countries as well, but it's mostly refugees. But actually, perhaps surprisingly, the anti-immigration levels in attitudes is much higher in poorer countries, right?
Really?
So people in poorer countries in general have more parochial attitudes. So I will show you in a bit how people feel about people of a different religion or of a different race, and they have more negative attitudes towards people from different countries. While in the West and in developed countries, this is a little bit better in the levels, but people have very strong negative responses if they've experienced bad conditions. And by education, yeah, this I don't want to overinterpret. So there is some evidence that maybe the low-skilled are more responsive to this, which is in line with what we find in the US. But these are becoming very small samples because we're not splitting just by country, we're also splitting by education. So I would say at least here we can say that there is some evidence, but I wouldn't overinterpret this too much. And the same there. And in the last few minutes, I just want to show you something about parochialism and in-group bias, because many people could make the argument that, you know, anti-immigration attitudes are not necessarily irrational for many people, right? So if you believe that there is competition, you may well be compassionate, you may well be empathetic, but there are economic reasons to be anti-immigrants. And so we try to understand how much is this economic reasons or economic kind of justifications, and how much is really parochialism, or you are just against people who are different from you. And so the World Value Surveys offers a nice opportunity to look at this because they ask a question in every wave, which groups of people you would not like as neighbors, right? You would not like them to live next to you. And one of the potential categories is immigrants or foreign workers. But they also ask them about people of a different race and people of a different religion. So again, we use the exact same estimation method, but now we look at these more parochial kind of outcome variables. And in panel A, we look at the full sample. And what's quite interesting is that these effects are consistent for all these kind of questions, right? So people who grew up in good times or experienced a doubling of income during their impressionable years are less likely to not want to live next to immigrants, but also less likely to not mind living next to people of a different race and people of a different religion. And what is particularly striking here, perhaps, is that, again, these effects seem to be much stronger, right, over double in size in some cases in the most rich countries. Right, so another way to interpret is if you grew up in recessions or you grew up in particularly bad times in a rich country, not only that you're going to have anti-immigration attitudes, but you are far more likely to not want to live next to somebody of a different religion or somebody of a different race, which to us kind of points in the idea of in-out group mentality. If there is an increase in compassion or more preferences for redistribution following these experiences, then this compassion is not going to be dished universally. It's going to be particularly towards people of your own social group or ethnic group. So just to kind of summarize this as well, growing up in better macroeconomic conditions tends to lower anti-immigration attitudes. We do find evidence that this is particularly pronounced in rich economies, although it does hold in developing nations as well. There is some evidence kind of in line with this labor market competition theories that it is stronger for low-skilled workers. And when it comes to the mechanisms, we believe that these types of experiences affect in-group bias more generally. So it kind of offers some evidence. If there is parochialism, if there are anti-immigration or anti-race attitudes, they could be partly explained by these experiences early in life. And so kind of the more broad conclusion from this research, I would say that there could be very long-term consequences of recessions, for example, political or social consequences, which right now are not necessarily linked to this experience. And I think it is important to further try to understand this. Support for more pro-poor policies seems to be less out of increased solidarity and more out of increased self-interest, although we don't have very direct evidence of this. But we do believe that these results show that, redistribution attitudes and immigration attitudes might be more strongly connected than previously believed. And perhaps the bad news is that tolerance might be hard to foster in difficult macroeconomic times or following difficult macroeconomic times. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop here and take some questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Actually, really right on time. 45 minutes. Perfect. Well, the floor is open to questions now.
Katja, could you go back over, so crucial, this income variable? I obviously got it wrong. If you put up the equation a second.
Yeah.
See, I was confused by the fact that you say income level I, R, T, but the fact is that this variable is the same for individual I throughout their life. So I think that T is very confusing there because it gives the impression it changes. I think take out the T.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So then I wondered if you could repeat your answer to Chris's question about obviously there's economic growth, there's trend growth going on. As somebody suggested, you could take cycle the level of the income level that counts a cycle. But what did you say? That's a good suggestion. But what was your answer?
So my answer was, so twofold. So the first part is what the previous literature does. So instead of looking at the growth, they actually construct recession indicators, because the problem with the growth as well is that it's very difficult to interpret, because, for example, if you have a huge recession in the UK this year, then growth next year will be huge, and so that will be interpreted as a very positive experience during your impressionable years, but that growth actually might still be followed by a lot of unemployment and joblessness. So it is difficult to interpret this growth when you switch between recessions and good times, because growing from a -5% to 0 is not the same as growing from 2 to 4%, right? Most people would prefer the second.
No, it's no good at all. So I think that the suggestion made that you should try and do the cyclical component of income is a very good one.
Okay. Yeah, so that is something
that's what Pavel suggested now.
Yeah.
What did you say, Chris?
I think that what Pavel suggested, right? Roderick Prescott filter and taking out the swing from the trend growth.
Yeah.
There's a Roderick Prescott filter will do it for you.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want, there's a paper which looks at similar question in the context of like willingness to invest in education and the part of the cycle. And so what they're doing, there's a new report by Giorgio Brunello from Padova. If you want, I can send it to you. And what they're doing is exactly they're taking Roderick Prescott filter. They filter employment and income using Roderick Prescott, and then they get the estimate of the cycle, and then they use it as a measure of being in recession or being during the boom.
Okay, that would be really useful. Yeah, so essentially you kind of detrend the cycle.
I think it's more nuanced than just detrending. But I think this is kind of what people have been using in this kind of literature, so that may be a good preference.
Yeah, okay, no, that would be great. So we should definitely check that as well, see if it changes our results. Great, thanks.
Might also matter, how you are relative to others in your region, right? I mean, whether you are sort of, how you're hit by a recession, but how you're also like in the distribution of the income in your area.
Yes, so yeah, I think we had this comment before, and it's on our list of things to look at. Yeah, it's a really good point, in the sense that yes, being in a region with a very high level of inequality, but also good economic growth, people might respond very differently. So yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. Of course, the problem with that is that we don't have personal, so in order to create this inequality, you would need to know people's personal income at that time. And so all we know is kind of like a band for family income at the age of 16, which would in a way make it very imprecise to calculate your percentage and distribution, but maybe it's enough to at least,
Yeah, maybe you can look at income inequality in a region from admin data.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's about how the pie is divided, right?
Yeah, no, that would be great. So I would have to check how back in the past inequality data goes, because for income we have data to 1929. I imagine data on regional inequality is probably more recent, but maybe we can at least look at the subsample of this. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
In your conclusions, you talk very briefly about the link between living, growing up in a recession and attitudes to redistribution. Could you please talk more about it? I think I didn't catch in the very last slide with these more global conclusions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so you showed a lot of attitudes to immigration. How is that? How do you interpret this in light of redistribution?
Right, so this kind of links back to the, for example, the Giuliano and Spirenberger study, which shows that if you grow up in a recession, people tend to be more positive about redistribution and they're more likely to vote Democrats. So without looking specifically at anti-immigration attitudes, you might actually consider, or at least the kind of expectation would be that people who are more likely to be pro-redistribution would also want to redistribute to migrants, or people who are more likely to vote Democrat would also be more pro-immigration. But we show that these things do not actually go hand in hand in the intuitive way we would expect them. And this kind of parochialism might provide the key to understanding that, in the sense that people might want to be more pro-redistribution if they grew up in bad times, but only for people from their group. Right, so if you grew up in the deep south and you are very poor, you might want redistribution, you might want social support or unemployment benefits, but not for those immigrants who come and steal them. You know, just for people who share your characteristics. So it's a little bit descriptive, but we think this is kind of the mechanism we had in hand. And so one thing we're thinking about looking in a separate paper is this growing trend in populism, where now you have a new brand of populists who are not just anti-immigration, but also pro-redistribution. So it would be interesting to see whether this is partly explaining this. So people who grew up in bad times, who actually don't have a very negative view of strong social welfare, but are still very anti-immigration, and perhaps have a bit more detailed data on actual economic and voting behavior with that. I
see. And do you have in the GSS, you do have some questions which can be linked to redistribution, right? Or this is what the previous paper's done? This is actually, yeah, very similar to what the previous paper done, and we can also replicate their findings, because essentially we use the same data, but this is what they've shown, that people do tend to vote more Democrat and think that redistribution is a good thing. I see. Thank you. Thanks.
Any further questions?
Okay.
Oh, silence. Okay. I think that basically is probably the first seminar well, not really the first, but probably one of the very few ones we actually are able to almost punctually finish. So if there are no more questions.
This is because Maria finished presentation 45 minutes sharp. I don't think it ever happened.
The first person actually made it like precisely on time. Ever.
Ever. There should be a medal for that. We should have a medal on the wall. Finishing presentation at 45 minutes. Yes.
No, but thanks so much for all your questions. They're very well taken, and thanks for all the comments. And yeah, I'd really like to get the paper that Paolo mentioned. That would be very useful. And Chris, you
Perfect.
also, I think, mentioned something from the
Uncertainty.
psychology literature. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, great. Then thank you so much for coming. And I hope to see everybody next week at the same time. Next week, we also have a very interesting presenter who is going to talk about the welfare effects of social media. That's a topic we had like several times already. But Sarah Eichmeier, who will be from the University of Munich, actually published a paper recently, an experimental paper on social welfare effects of, welfare well-being effects of social media in the American Economic Review. So I think it's going to be a very nice paper next week as well. So hope to see many of you then, and I wish you all the best until then.